Hello dear learner, I welcome you to the lecture 1 of week 7, and the topic of today's lecture is the public-private dichotomy. It is part of the main subject of the week 7, which is feminism. Now, first of all, we will discuss the various concepts which will be covered in today's lecture. First is the backdrop of the public and private debate, then tracing the various liberal arguments, then feminist critique of the liberal public private dichotomy, then what are the various problems which are associated with the private public debate, then what we understand by the slogan the personal is political, and finally we come to the conclusion. So, let us begin the issue of the public private dichotomy by quoting the words of Carol Patman, and I quote, "The dichotomy between the private and the public is central to almost 2 centuries of feminist writing and political struggle. It is ultimately what the feminist movement is about." So, Carol Patman puts into the central or the focal point of the feminist debate or the feminist issues the private public dichotomy, and it is argued that it is central to the feminist writing and discourse for almost 2 centuries. So, therefore, when we are studying feminism, it is very essential to study what we mean by the private public dichotomy, or what we mean by the public sphere and what we mean by the private sphere. Now, the liberal political thought conceptualized public and private sphere in relation to the individual in the state. So, if we have to understand the notion of private and public sphere, we have to go to the liberal tradition, because origin of public and private sphere is related with the rise of liberalism, and it was in relation to the individual and the state. With the rise of the state, with the rise of political sphere, there arose another sphere which was limited to the domestic work, and it was designated as a private sphere. Initially, state action was limited to the public sphere, excluding any operation in the private sphere from its ambit. So, since private sphere was named as private, so obviously any type of activities was considered, even if it was an oppressive activity, it was considered a private matter, and the state was supposed to not interfere in the private life of the individual. And it was also felt necessary, according to tenets of liberalism, that states should not interfere in the private lives of the individual, and the private autonomy was highly valued, and it was given lots of importance in the liberal society. Now, this private public distinction was seen as natural, trans-historical and trans-cultural. It was considered natural because it was felt that this type of dichotomy will be very beneficial for the society, and various justifications were given, like the women are supposed to perform the reproductive functions, or they are the weaker sex. So, therefore, they are to be limited to the private sphere or the domestic sphere. They will take care of the child, they will take care of the caring functions, and they will be performing the domestic chores, whereas in the public sphere, outer world, men will go and perform their duties. So, it was considered very natural, and now also even in the present society, this division of labor is considered very natural, and it is trans-cultural and trans-historical. It has been found across different historic phases, it has been found across cultures, whether it is the Western culture or the non-Western culture. Now, the public sphere encompassed business, economy, politics, law. So, anything which is outside the domestic sphere, that has been considered as the public sphere. The private sphere encompassed domestic domains like family, which had women in positions of subordination. Now, why private sphere is important? Because women were located to the private sphere, and there was no problem if women were simply located to private sphere. The problem started occurring when women were not only located to private sphere, but they were also being given an inferior position, or they were placed in a position of subordination in the private sphere. Now, the distinction however is complex, going beyond just separating the two forms of activities. So, it is not that simple as we are trying to make out in our presentation, because we know that there are multiple shades in between, and different scholars have debated the interrelationship between the private and the public sphere, or which sphere is more important than the other, whether we give more importance to the private sphere or more importance to the public sphere, and what shall be the role and to what extent state can interfere in the private sphere. Because then there is the issue of privacy or autonomy of the individual that also needs to be protected. Then it denies a symbiotic dependent relationship between the two spheres. Because if we make a binary separation, as it has been done in the liberal tradition, then we are making a strict compartmentalization of two functions. Whereas, if we better recognize it as a symbiotic type of relation, symbiotic means that one derives from the other, one derives its sustenance from the others. For example, I would like to explain this point by mentioning that when the men they go out to work in the public sphere, in the offices or in politics, they leave behind their family and the responsibilities of the children on the shoulder of women. Because women are back home taking care of the children and their old parents and taking full charge of the domestic responsibilities, therefore, the men are relieved and they are free from all tensions and worries, and hence they are able to participate more actively and be more productive in the public sphere. Now, this performance of the symbiotic function by the woman, where a man could function successfully if the woman is performing her role back at home, is nothing else but a symbiotic relationship. Just imagine a condition where a man is coming out to work in the sphere of politics, or for that matter in any area of public life, where he has a constant worry of who is going to take care of his children or who is going to take care of his elderly parents. Then imagine that what type of stress under which he will be working and how that will affect the productivity. So, therefore, it is very important to recognize the contribution of women in the domestic sphere rather than relegating to inferior position the domestic function and also the role played by women in that. Now, the public sphere is represented as superior to the private sphere. So, it is not only the non-recognition of the work done by the woman in the private sphere, but also considering private sphere as inferior or in a subordinate position to the public sphere. Therefore, you see that a man is going out and he is earning and he is gaining lots of recognition, rewards and prizes in the public sphere, and the same woman is working tirelessly throughout the day till her death, but she is getting no recognition, no rewards, no income and no appreciation which a man gets by doing the same amount of labor in the public sphere. So, therefore, it is to be recognized that the work done in the private sphere is equally important and perhaps more important, because the entire economy in the public sphere is dependent upon the unpaid labor done by the woman in the domestic sphere. Now, feminists reject the absolute separation of private from the public life. Now, there are certain feminists who are more vocal when they say there cannot be absolute separation, and this separation has been responsible for the neglect of various politics which has taken place or have been taking place in the private sphere. Sexual division of labor created notions of unpaid female labor within families, and yes, with the division of the private public dichotomy also took place the division of labor. The men were supposed to go out and earn, and the women were supposed to stay back and look after agriculture, take care of the parents and also raise children. This division of labor created or had impact on certain more phenomena which took place, and one of them was the unpaid female labor within the families. So, it is not only that their work is not recognized, but it is also unpaid, and I have just said how it provides the base and foundation for the entire success of capitalist economy, though the labor performed by women is considered non-productive, whereas the labor performed by men in the public sphere is considered productive. Second is that this sexualized division of labor have led to notion, or it has created women's access to undervalued jobs. So, whatever little opportunities she has got in the public sphere, they have been mostly localized or limited to undervalued jobs, and it shows the political nature of public private debate. So, basically we have to understand that this sexualized division of labor or division of two compartments was not non-political, it was very much political in nature, because the way the division of labor was done, keeping in mind the interest of certain group or community. Feminist critique of this public private divide include: first, situating women in the private sphere led to systematic exclusion from the public life. Now things have changed, now the women are so much visible, or gradually their visibility in the public sphere is increasing. But few years back also, and if you go to much earlier times before independence or maybe in the medieval era, you will find that women's visibility in the public sphere was just negligible. So, what was the reason behind that? One of the reason behind that, they were restricted to private sphere. They were situated in the private sphere, and since their lives revolved around the private sphere, there were many barriers and restrictions for them to come out and participate. So, there was a systematic exclusion from the public sphere. Second is emphasis on the political nature of the private sphere. Family, marriage, kinship, where power dynamics operate. Because politics is a study of power relation, and if you try to understand the private sphere, then we all know that for a considerable period of time, the private sphere was considered non-political, because political was something which was limited to public sphere. Politics was understood in a different sense. But if we take the definition of politics as struggle for power or as a power relation, then that power relation is visible not only in the public sphere, but also in the family, also in the marriage relation, also in the relationship between the parents and the child, also in the relationship amongst the kins. So, if you try to analyze the power dynamics between husband and wife, you will find that is highly unequal in nature, especially in the case of a family where the man is an earning member and the woman is a housewife, because the housewife has to be always dependent on the male member or on her husband for fulfilling her economic needs. So, therefore, this dependency, this economic dependency creates the possibilities for dominance, creates the possibility for exploitation, and moreover makes her so much vulnerable for any sort of future mishappening, because she is not economically independent. So, any mishappening make her more vulnerable, and that increases her vulnerability and dependence on various other factors, so that she can ensure her protection. So, therefore, economic empowerment is considered a very important aspect of women's empowerment, and for economic empowerment she has to participate in the public life. Now, the divide denied women's rights to equality in both family and public domains. So, this divide not only lowered the position of women in the private sphere by making her more vulnerable, dependent upon the male members, but also in her exclusion in the public sphere, her very limited presence in the public sphere, and the absence of opportunities to develop her potentialities led to her lowering of position also in the public domain. Now, this public private dichotomy is visible across multiple spheres. It is visible in the international law, human rights discourse, it is visible in work and economy, it is visible in public participation, it is also found in the division of domestic labor, which is gendered, where we find that women are supposed to do the domestic chores and the men are supposed to go out and work, skewed reproductive labor, and also politics and ethics of care, where the essentialist virtues of women such as care and reproduction glorified, and they are constituted to be the essential feminist qualities. Now, the second wave feminism have questioned the patriarchal nature of the public private divide, because they have argued that simply by talking equality, simply by talking about equal rights is not enough to address various forms of exploitation and victimization which women are facing, and the sources of their victimization can be addressed only when we understand or we focus our attention on the private public divide. Because when we are talking about equal opportunities for women in the public sphere, when we are talking about equal voting rights, when we are talking about equal political rights or equal social and economic rights, they cannot be actualized if women are not visible and allowed to participate in the public sphere. And this can be done only when we challenge or address the issues which are at the roots of women's invisibility in the public sphere. Therefore, the second wave feminism have questioned the patriarchal nature of public private divide, because patriarchal nature where it is dominated by the male perspective or where it is dominated by the patriarchs who are nothing but the male members of the society. So, traditional theorists equated male with public and female with private spheres. Debates ensued regarding the universality of these gendered institutions. When these type of divisions were made and they were considered to be universal, various debates started and they questioned whether this type of gender distinction can be universally applicable. Feminist critique extend to practical implication, advocating for state interventions in private matters. So, feminist critique extended to practical implications, advocating for state interventions in private matters. Why? Because there are the roots of oppression or various reasons or foundation for oppression of women can be found in the domestic sphere. And for a larger period of time in the liberal state, it was considered not proper for the state to interfere in the private sphere. Therefore, multiple forms of exclusion, domination and discrimination which were practiced in the private sphere were not accounted for by the state. Therefore, the second wave feminists, they argued for state intervention in the private sphere. Now, what were those issues in the private sphere, along with the fact that women were limited to the private sphere and were entrusted with the domestic responsibilities? The issues were marital rape, spousal abuse, abortion rights. These were some of the very important, and of course, domestic violence. These were some of the issues which were very severe and sometimes very important to understand, and laws were needed to control such practices. Especially for a long period of time, domestic violence was considered a private matter of the couple, and people across the neighborhood, they hesitated to interfere or stop the domestic violence because they believed that it is their private matter and one should not interfere in the private matter. So, once even few years back, when domestic violence was considered a private issue, to a time when domestic violence has been recognized an issue of concern in the public sphere and laws have been formulated to prohibit the onset of domestic violence. So, therefore, Carol Hanisch very important slogan, "Personal is political," emphasized the political nature of private life. Personal is political means that political is not limited only to the public sphere, but there is very much politicization of the private sphere also. So, this personal is political was a very important slogan that highlighted how the private public dichotomy had created so much of problems and is at the root of so many types of discrimination against women. Now, interest in the private public dichotomy in gender studies due to its gendered association. First of all, masculinity associated with the public sphere and the femininity associated with the private sphere. Of course, we have been talking about this since the beginning of this lecture, that we are talking about the private public dichotomy because of the gendered association of these spheres, and masculinity has been associated with the public life, and also there is certain masculinity, that masculine qualities or attributes which has been associated with the public sphere. There are certain feminine attributes which are associated with the private sphere. For example, the quality of brave, bold, rational, these were the qualities which were associated with the masculinity, whereas femininity were associated with qualities of emotion, then love, then care, in nature, then qualities of sustenance, etc. Now, when we talk about tracing the liberal arguments, we find that the origin of public private debate can be traced to social contract theorists. So, it was with the coming of the social contract theory of the state and the establishment of the state, we find that there is also talk about the public private dichotomy, where the people who are in control of the state, who are working in the public sphere, were considered to be the men, and those who are in the domestic sphere were women. The social contract made within the liberal tradition made a distinction between public and political and private and non-political sphere, which can be traced back to Aristotle's ideas. Now, if you try to understand the origin of these divides, we can find that it can be traced to the Aristotle's ideas or to the Greek political thinker or during the Greek times. And the most important part of this distinction is that during the formulation of this divide, the private sphere was considered as non-political and public sphere was considered as political. And you see, the second wave feminist or the radical feminism have given a totally different slogan, which is personal is political or private sphere is also political. So, you can see the shift in idea. Now, what is the feminist critique of the liberal public private dichotomy? The first is questions where and why the dividing line is drawn and the need for it, and why it is drawn, what is the purpose behind it, and the second is centrality of demands for equal rights for women in both the spheres. So, we are not only demanding for equal rights of women in the public sphere, but equal rights is also needed in the private sphere. And to understand the symbiotic and the interdependent relationship between the private sphere and the public sphere, and viewed the separation as a patriarchal phase of liberalism. So, that is one of the important critiques of liberalism, that the liberal theory have ignored the feminist issues, or they have failed to incorporate the feminist standpoint, and therefore, this separation of the private and public debate and the repercussion it had on the woman's life, women's rights and opportunities is considered to be a very negative aspect of liberalism, and according to feminist perspective, it is the patriarchal phase of liberalism. Now, the social structure of liberalism seen as a politically contested arena. Even the social structure of liberalism is not free from politics, it is also a very much contested arena. Question liberal states claim to enable impersonal use of state power. If you read the liberal notion of state, then you find that as per the social contract theories, the state has been created to protect the rights and liberties of the individual, and this state is supposed to function in an impersonal manner. But the feminists have questioned that is it really functioning in an impersonal manner, or there is a gendered functioning of the state also. These are some of the questions and criticism which has been raised against the public private divide. Feminist interrogations across various strands with dilemmas such as whether civil society forms a part of the private or the public. Now, there is a very enormous space which is occupied by the civil society. Feminists question that where to place it. Should it form part of the private sphere or should it form part of the public sphere? Then the liberalism based on patriarchy and class relations or patriarchal liberalism. So, this is also one of the dilemma. On the one hand, the liberalism is talking about the equality of rights, and on the other hand, the patriarchal face of liberalism is another dilemma which the feminists have been facing. Then the distinction between the public and the private reflects unequal gender relations, thus subjugating women. So, these are some of the dilemmas or the problems which the feminists have faced while they are interrogating the feminist or the public private dichotomy. So, with that I come to the end of this lecture, followed by a few activity questions which are based on the topics or what we have learnt in today's lecture. First, why do feminists consider the distinction between public and private problematic? Now, we have understood the meaning of public sphere. We have also came to know what is the private sphere and how it affects the position of women or the feminist perspective, or it has affected women's life across so many years. So, why it is considered problematic, and you have to answer that based on the topics which are covered. From a feminist viewpoint, how does the public private dichotomy manifest? How does it manifest? Within the theoretical framework of public private separation, how are gender issues explained? You can give this answer with the help of some of the examples which you find around you. So, with this I come to the end of this lecture. Thank you very much.